And Jesus says, listen, you have no idea. That's how the rulers of this age organize things. We're going to do it the other way. The one who wants to be great among you must be your servant, because the Son of Man came to give his life, etc. And so there's a sense of redefinition of empire, redefinition of what rulership really means. As Bishop Barron was saying last night, people in the ancient world and many in the modern world live on the principle of peace comes through violence.
Yeah.
You squash all the opposition and then we have peace, don't we? Tacitus reports that the ancient Britain said at the end of the first century, they make a wilderness and call it peace. Well, we're still there. But in terms of the kingdom of God, we look after the poor and the disadvantaged and the humble and the weak. And that is what we call a kingdom. And that is the true shalom.
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name is Pierpaolo Finaldi, CEO and publisher of the CTS, and your host for this podcast. It's my very great honour to be able to speak today to Dr. N.T. Wright, who is the renowned English New Testament scholar and Pauline theologian, Anglican Bishop of Durham from 2003 to 2010, currently Research Professor Emeritus of New Testament at St Andrews, and I think very well known for your Ask N.T. Wright Anything podcast. So I'm going to give it a go and try and ask you anything today. But welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Very good to be with you.
Good. So we're here at the Bishop Barron conference on the Bible, and we started yesterday with a couple of really interesting talks. And the interesting thing here, we're at the Excel in East London, and we're following straight on from the ARC conference, which was, I think there were 4,000 people here speaking about a new kind of politics in which the Judeo-Christian roots of especially the West were often brought up, probably not as much as we would want. But your latest book about Christ and the powers of the world kind of is in this area. So I wanted to kind of maybe start by talking a bit about that. So what kind of led you to write about that in particular now?
Like many New Testament scholars, I've been aware that in the Bible there is this question of the dark powers that hover over all human affairs. And we in the modern West aren't very good at talking about that because ever since the 18th century we've kind of said either that's superstition or if such powers exist, they're nothing to do with us, and we just leave the world to be run by ordinary humans like ourselves. In fact, in the ancient world, people were they didn't have a clear theory about what was going on, so to speak, but most people in the ancient world had a sort of multidimensional sense that even though you might be faced with somebody who called himself Caesar or some other power in the human level, there were shadowy forces at work. And the fact that we call them forces tells its own story, because today we talk about economic forces or societal forces or whatever. And if you stop and say, hang on, what does that mean? Is it simply the accumulation of what a large number of influential people think? And again, and certainly looking at the history of the 20th century, I think we want to say, no, it's a bit more than that. That, I mean, we all refer to it, and it's a cliche, but what went wrong in Germany in the 1930s was more than the sum total of the human wickedness of certain individuals. Something seemed to be gathering force and speed, and of course, in our own day, one could say we are witnessing very similar things. So, all my life as a New Testament scholar, I've been aware of that dimension. And what happened 2 or 3 years ago was that my colleague Mike Bird from Australia said, now, Tom, you've been writing about this on the edge of stuff. How about I go through your works and pull out the key bits and turn them into a new book, and then we each write a couple more chapters and string it together. And so that's what we did. So really, the slightly frustrating thing was we hoped it would come out in time to have some impact on elections, both in Britain and America. I'm not sure it had any impact at all, but I do hope it's made a lot of Christian readers sit up and think, wait a minute, here are dimensions that we need to take far more seriously.
I mean, I don't know if you've been following. I mean, there's certainly been within the Catholic world, and I think it's kind of gone beyond that as well. The post-liberal project, the post-liberal ideas of Patrick Deneen and people like that have, come to the centre of power with somebody like J.D. Vance as the vice president in the States. I mean, how do you think? Because that essentially kind of calls for a way of looking at politics which doesn't distinguish so clearly between church and state. I mean, what do you think? How do you approach that?
There are so many different sub-questions underneath that one, because obviously the American Constitution makes a clear distinction going back to the old days in New England when they had escaped religious persecution in the 17th century in Britain, and so we jolly well weren't going to have church and state bumping into each other, and America has found it impossible to live with that, and so the trouble when you have a vacuum is that when the vacuum is split, all sorts of bad things happen. And here in Britain, we haven't had a vacuum because we've had an established church for better and for worse. But actually, we are just as much a secular society in our way.
Well, in a sense, almost maybe more than in the States.
Exactly, almost more, because America does still style itself as one nation under God. Nobody quite knows what that's supposed to mean. And in God we trust on dollar bills, but then also Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is a quote from Virgil about a new order of the ages. So you've got what James Davison Hunter, the sociologist from Virginia, calls the hybrid Enlightenment, where from the 18th century onwards, you've still got an old Puritan streak coming through. We are godly people. We pray about things. We try to serve God in our lives, and that's why we can now have a good democracy. But at the same time, you had a rationalist element, which was saying, no, if you want to worship God, go and see him on Sundays, like going and visiting an elderly relative in a care home. But then for the rest of the week, get back to business as usual.
And real life.
Real life, yes, as though real life could be separated from the other dimensions. So, I mean, I think the chickens are coming home to roost on both sides of the Atlantic and many other places as well, where the issues that we haven't got clear on are now chasing each other around the room. And part of the problem of that is that the whole cultural and political and theological scene has been hollowed out, leaving, as Nietzsche said, this kind of vacuum where all claims to truth are claims to power, etc., etc. And in fact, is there any such thing as truth? It's just you and me, your truth, my truth. And the questions of personal identity are all up for grabs. And we don't have a shared discourse, either in the church or in the world, with which to handle this. As a result, we have these huge mood swings. And if I was a counsellor seeing somebody having the sort of mood swings that corresponded to the political mood swings that are going on at the moment, I would say, we need to do some serious therapy.
So
here.
when you're talking about these mood swings, over what kind of time scale are you talking about these swings
over the last 20, 30 years.
Right.
I mean, I have watched in this country and I go to the States quite a lot, but I've watched in this country what now very loosely we call the woke agenda coming up. I mean, 30 years ago, the whole question of so-called trans identity simply wasn't on the table at all. Nobody saw that one coming. But then all sorts of other things nobody saw coming, like the rise and influence of social media, or like the rise and influence of radical Islam, and so on. These are factors which have impinged on our nice, cosy, would-be social democracy, and we haven't really known how to cope with them. And so people swing from saying we ought to be completely liberal and accept people for what they claim to be, to saying, no, actually, there are questions of truth and identity at stake here, but then how do we handle that? And at the moment, certainly in Britain, I don't think we're having mood swings. We just, as usual in Britain, we get muddled. And we sort of fuddle our way through, and old agendas come creeping through on both sides of the political divide. And in America, though, it's a radical split between the woke agenda as represented by Kamala Harris in the last election and something which seems to be completely opposite, although also including, just the news this last 2 or 3 weeks, what appears to most of us, I was saying this cautiously because I have a lot of friends on both sides of the divide in America, but what appears to most people to be moves towards a dictatorship. I mean, Trump actually referring to himself as king, however ironic that is. So we are in very strange times, and I don't think anyone saw that coming either.
Yeah. And I mean, what do you think? I mean, you've looked at this, especially through the lens of what kind of Paul says about the powers of the world.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
having managed to kind of secularize, despite having an established church in the UK, what could a kind of Christian UK kind of look like based on biblical values?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you think of biblical values, my mind goes back to one of the great psalms in the Old Testament. It was on the royal psalm, Psalm 72. And some people don't like the royal psalms because they say we don't like kings, they're all dictatorial, etc. But in fact, Psalm 72 celebrates the king because he looks after the poor and the needy and the orphan and the widow. And this goes with that larger Deuteronomic strand of not only the widow and the orphan, but also the stranger, the alien in your midst. That these are the priority. They're not people who you might get around to helping a little bit when you've done everything else. The reason that this king, this ideal king, is to be praised is because he's caring for the weakest in society. And if you go back to the early church, the one thing that Peter and Paul said, this is absolutely crucial in Galatians 2, very, very early, is that we should remember the poor. And Paul says that's exactly what I was eager to do. And in the 2nd and 3rd century, when the Romans were trying to stamp out the church, they didn't know much about the church, but they knew that there were these people called bishops who were always banging on about the needs of the poor. Isn't that great? Now, so if you want to say what it would look like to have a Christian country, it would be a country that really does reorganize its priorities. So instead of giving tax breaks the richest and bailing out the bankers expensively when they crash and burn because they've been silly, then we should say, no, the priority is the people at the bottom of the pile. If we get that right, everything else will look after itself.
What do you think of this idea that I think Tom Holland in particular has kind of championed, which is that, for example, wokeism is a kind of Christian heresy?
I think that's right. I mean, I don't know Tom Holland very well, but we have met on a number of occasions, and his book Dominion is obviously the crucial thing here. And I think he's absolutely right. I mean, Holland's a historian, particularly of the ancient world. He looked at the Roman world and saw their values and the things that they prioritized, and the role of violence and the attitude to slaves and women and foreigners, etc., etc. And then you just contrast. And even though we get so many things wrong in the modern world, there's a sense that the moral compass has changed drastically, and the whole woke agenda is I see it as a corrupt version of the passion for justice. And the passion for justice is a biblical imperative. God intends to put all things right, and he wants his people to be putting right people as part of that project. Now, if then, I mean, this goes back in my mind to something that the previous Pope Benedict said in a speech to the United Nations in April 2008 in New York, when he said that Europe had drifted away from its Judeo-Christian roots, but was still trying to get the results of the Judeo-Christian tradition without those roots, and it can't be done. What will happen will be that you will end up with lots of special interest groups, and there will be a cacophony of them all clamoring for attention and all claiming to be the victims, which is the only bit of high moral ground that's left. Now, I think he's absolutely right. That's precisely what we're looking at. So, I mean, the trouble is, of course, the phrase Judeo-Christian is itself deeply, as somebody who works in first century Judaism as well as Christianity, there's so many issues going on there, but at least there is something there. Last night, Bishop Barron was talking about creation very powerfully, Genesis 1. We share that with our Jewish brothers and sisters, a sense that the created world is good and was made good and is to be celebrated and enhanced and rescued and so on. That's a great starting point.
Yeah, because in a sense that to accept that we've been created accepts also that there's a kind of givenness to what we are as human beings, and even the world itself. So that it comes from God. So I think another kind of strain that has sort of come up in the last few years, this idea of kind of Christian nationalism, and I mean, I think both as Catholics and I think Anglicans in particular, there is a sense that a church can exist within a particular kind of nation with its own particular, style and nuances. But how do you think that the nation and Christianity, which has such a kind of claim on a universal claim, how do those two kind of work together? And is it something that we kind of should look for, or is it something that we should kind of maybe push against a bit?
I think we should be very worried about it, because the way that that's come up, particularly, is that since the Reformation and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, certainly in the West, Christian faith has been very much about me and my spirituality and my heavenly home, etc., and away from kind of geo-imperialism. But that leaves a vacuum, and the geo-imperialism has been making a comeback. And then particularly with the founding of both the United States and Canada and various other places, a sense of trying to retrieve bits of the Old Testament as though now we were the new chosen people. I mean, I lived in Montreal for 5 years, and the old Quebecois folk ways of telling it were that French Canada was the new Jerusalem. Well, and America has its own versions of that, and city set on a hill, etc. And the danger of that is that you idolize your own existence, and precisely then you forget the responsibility for the outsider and the alien and the stranger and so on. And the other thing to remember is that the idea that we have today in the modern Western world of a nation is a very, very modern idea. People in the first century, most countries did not have borders that were policed in the way that we think of them. They had a capital city or whatever, and the hinterland around that was the nation, but there were all sorts of areas where anything might happen out in the wilds. And so our idea of fixed nations and how they run themselves is a very modern idea, and we have to be careful then of simply grabbing bits of Christianity that seem to sustain our sense, particularly our ambitions. And I mean, you'd have thought that after the 20th century nobody would want to go near Christian nationalism, but it's coming up again. And the other point,
if I may,
sure.
I wouldn't say maybe push back, but just say, and yet the incarnation, meant that Christ was born in a particular place, and that the church, there were the churches of these different cities, and they all had their particular kind of way of doing things, and in a sense that's always been part of the rich kind of tapestry of Christianity.
That's certainly true. I mean, the 5 great seas in the 3rd and 4th century and 5th century, etc., which were very different culturally. I mean, from Athens to Alexandria with Antioch and others in between, and Rome. But in the middle of all of that, the early church, they travelled a lot. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. The Roman road system was such that if you look at people going around, Ignatius on his way to Rome to be martyred, he's able to travel through several countries, and they seem to have got about, and Paul's letters are circulated all over the place, etc., etc. So I don't think there was that sense that we would know now of, I belong in Greece and that's where I am. Of course, ordinary poor people often didn't travel at all. They didn't travel from their village. Still some parts of the world today where that's true. Still some parts of this country, actually, where that's true. But
London, mainly, stay within the M25.
Well, no, but I mean, I'm from the northeast, and there are towns and villages I know in the northeast where the furthest away people have ever been would be maybe to York on one occasion, and then they scurried back to Newcastle or Sunderland or wherever. Oh, I went south. That was far too much. And yeah, I mean, we laugh, but it's how many people still do live. Anyway, the sense of belonging to a place, yes, that is built in, but Jesus being born as a Judean and then living in Galilee and then ministering in that part of the world, if you go back to the Psalms and the prophets, especially Isaiah, again and again, the texts that the early Christians and Jesus himself draw on are all about, it's too light for you just to be the light for Israel. I will give you a light to the nations, that my glory may extend to the whole world. And that's already built in to one of the basic Psalms, Psalm 2, where the promise to Abraham about I'll give you this land as an inheritance is transformed, and God says to the Davidic king, I will give you the nations as your inheritance, the uttermost parts of the world for your possession. And then Jesus at the beginning of Acts says, you'll be going from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. with the sense that now there is one single kingdom, which is God's kingdom, and it doesn't look like human kingdoms. And then that's where you have the whole redefinition of what being a king is all about, as in Mark 10, where James and John want to sit at Jesus' right and his left. They want to be Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary or whatever. I think they're stealing a march on Peter and Andrew in case they get in first. And Jesus says, listen, you have no idea. That's how the rulers of this age organize things. We're going to do it the other way. The one who wants to be great among you must be your servant, because the Son of Man came to give his life, etc. And so there's a sense of redefinition of empire, redefinition of what rulership really means. As Bishop Barron was saying last night, people in the ancient world and many in the modern world live on the principle of peace comes through violence.
Yeah.
You squash all the opposition and then we have peace, don't we? Tacitus reports that the ancient Britain said at the end of the first century, they make a wilderness and call it peace. Well, we're still there. But in terms of the kingdom of God, we look after the poor and the disadvantaged and the humble and the weak. And that is what we call a kingdom. And that is the true shalom.
So one of the things that this conference is about, and something that I always try and pick up on in the podcast, is to say, okay, so we're called to bring the message of Christ, the biblical message of the peace that Christ brings in our own kind of context, and particularly in the UK. I think what would you say are the particular kind of challenges that we face bringing this message to our brothers and sisters in our own country?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first challenge is that the church has to be the church, and the church is designed to be, and this is one of my strap lines in my teaching over the last few years, the church is designed to be a small working model of new creation. That just as in the ancient world, people should look at this community and say, didn't know you could live like that. It happens particularly strikingly when something horrible and ugly happens, like that time when there was a bomb in Northern Ireland and people were killed, and immediately one of the people who'd lost his daughter said, I forgive. And it happens in Amish communities in America, where somebody does a horrible act of violence and the Amish say, we are people of forgiveness. And I've heard an Egyptian bishop say this when hardline Muslims were burning churches. An Egyptian bishop saying, our whole raison d'etre as Christians is that we are people of forgiveness. And that's not something which people are used to. And we Christians find it difficult too. But so to be a community that marches to a different drummer, to use the cliche, that's the basis. But then it works out from there as people look and see, these are the people who come round and help when the baby died, or when Granny was so sick, or whatever. And it's not because they're necessarily part of our community. William Temple famously said the church is the only community that exists for the benefits of its non-members. Right. The great line. And as long as the church is doing that and is seen to be doing that, I mean, I was thrilled when I was Bishop of Durham at the many parts of the Society of County Durham, some really difficult, some places with huge social problems, where they would come to the church for partnership and help, because they knew that the church had boots on the ground where there were drug gangs, where there was high youth unemployment, where there was this, where there was that we were actually able to say, no, we are there, we will work with you for the betterment of this whole society and to transform a school or whatever it may be. So that's the way it happens. And in that context, sooner or later people say, who is this Jesus you keep talking about?
Now, one thing that I mean, we're here at a conference which is essentially people talking to each other, lots of people coming to listen. And I'm kind of fascinated at what has become, one of the most important ways of communicating. The new media, nobody knew what direction it was kind of going in. And we've seen now that the most popular formats are people just talking to each other at great length, and
isn't that funny?
It's strange.
We used to say, you can't have talking heads, that's too boring, but actually you see a lot of people seem to want it.
Yeah, well, the number one podcast in the world, Joe Wright, he speaks to people 3 hours at a time. And I think in the end, I think it brings us back to what St. Paul said, that faith comes through listening. So let's have maybe we can kind of round off our little chat. So What does that mean in today's context, and how can we kind of make that happen? What do we need to learn?
Yeah. I mean, in context, when Paul says that, and the Greek word he uses is akoe, which actually isn't just the act of listening, it's the thing that is heard. And in Paul's Hebrew hinterland, that goes back to the root Shema, which is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And hearing there isn't just listening, it's listening with a view to taking it in and being shaped by it. But at the same time, yes, of course, Paul is very clear that it's the word, and he's quoting earlier in the chapter from Deuteronomy 30, which says that when God renews Israel and the world, it will be because the word is near you, on your lips and in your heart, and that will transform you. And so Paul has this sometimes seemingly quite extraordinary belief that when you walk into a strange town and stand up and say, the world has a new Lord and he's a crucified and risen Jew called Jesus, even though that's nonsense, that word does its work. And Paul is there looking back to passages like Isaiah 55, where, like the rain and the snow coming down and making things grow, so will God's word be. It will not return to him empty, but will profit in the thing for which he sends it. And there'll be a new fruitfulness and a sort of sense throughout the Old Testament. God spoke and it was done. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth, in the Psalms. And then that Isaiah and the other prophets, a sense that whereas we humans lurch towards raw power, actually the word is the thing. And when the word is the word of the good news of Jesus, that the God who made the world has become one of us and has done this, that and the other, and has launched God's new creation, then even when people are hostile to it, they sometimes find that something's happening inside them. When they hear that word, a certain space opens up and they realize that they are loved and that new creation is happening. That's what's going on. But of course, if it doesn't produce faith, it just becomes noise. But Paul says when the word goes out, faith comes, and then everything is open from there on.
And how does that work in the UK, where we have a kind of natural reserve and politeness? We don't particularly like kind of preaching or speaking.
I know, but I think it often happens basically through friendship, that when people get to know one another and trust one another. I mean, I've often had this experience that people that I vaguely know, there are certain subjects that you just wouldn't talk about, like the state of your marriage or whatever it might be. But then when you get to know them better, by whatever means, then at a certain point, somebody may say, by the way, tell me, if this is going too far, do say, but just tell me about such and such. Then there are such moments, and then and I've had this experience that sometimes when you've been praying for somebody or about a particular situation, then quite suddenly there's a chink of light or a door is open. And I think back to the prophet Ezekiel, who's told he's got a message from the Lord, but by the way, you're going to be silent for the next 3 years or whatever it is. And then at a certain point, now you can open your mouth and speak. And I think there is a nervousness about not speaking, about, oh dear, I ought to be telling everybody all the time. And maybe some people are called to be professional buttonholers, sit next to somebody on the bus and, well, I mean, what do you think about Jesus? That's never been my style, and I've never felt particularly guilty that that's not my style. But sometimes when I'm sitting on a bus, I might be reading the Bible and somebody might say, excuse me, why are you reading the Bible? Fine, let's have the conversation.
No, absolutely. I mean, I for a while used to do kind of door knocking, going to tell people. I used to find it excruciating. My wife just loved it.
Oh, really?
So, it really is, it really kind of horses for courses on those things. And I think God gives us the...
It's the same. I've had one job I did some years ago. I had to do some fundraising. I absolutely hated every minute of it. I'm hopeless at asking people for anything, especially money. There were other people who were brilliant at it, and I would watch them just in the natural way, putting people at their ease and saying, now we have this wonderful project and it'd be wonderful if you could partner with us. And I would think, I don't know how you do that. It's just not my gift. So, as you say, horses for courses.
So maybe just a final question. You're here at a kind of biblical conference run by a big Catholic apostolate. How have you, what do you see as a kind of different way in which maybe perhaps Catholics look at the Bible as opposed to the Anglican or kind of more Protestant kind of.
There's no one-size-fits-all.
Right.
I mean, I've done a lot of ecumenical work between Roman Catholics and Anglicans because in my previous job, but one, I was one of the people who the Anglican Church would send to Rome for meetings or meet with Roman Catholic counterparts in this country. So I'm quite used to that and to the different styles. What I've observed ever since 2008, when I was the Anglican observer at the Synod of Bishops in Rome, which was on the Word of God, that there were bishops and cardinals from around the world who were aware, because of social media, because of radio and so on, that their congregations in the Philippines or in Latin America were listening to Bible messages from Protestant denominations and were then going to their local priest and saying, can you tell us about the prophet Isaiah or about the book of Revelation or whatever? And so the response was, we have to make sure that every Catholic man, woman, child, cat and dog is able to read the Bible in their own language and talk and think about it, and we mustn't be afraid of that. We've got to get into it. And my response to that was, if only that had been said 400 years ago, we wouldn't have had all this trouble, because that's all that certainly in England, that's all that the Protestant reformers really wanted, to have the Bible in our own language and then let God do through the Bible what he's going to do. Now, for me, the really exciting thing is some of my closest colleagues in biblical studies are Roman Catholics from whatever tradition. And certainly listening to Bishop Barron last night, I sat there thinking, I think he and I have been reading the same books. You know, that there is a tremendous convergence over what the Bible means, how it works, and so on. And we need to seize this moment and develop it in any way we can.
Yeah, and as our society seems to kind of be going in the opposite direction, I think those who have faith in this word that God has given us, I think we need to have a united front.
And we need to move beyond the old sterile either-ors of the 18th century where, some would say, oh, every word of the Bible is inspired, therefore, and then somebody comes back and says, but there's a contradiction here between the way Matthew says this and the way Luke says this. Come on, let's grow up. These are wonderful ancient documents. If you know anything about ancient documents, of course there are going to be odd bits here and there. What else should you expect? But that doesn't mean that it's all made up. The trouble is we've lurched from a fundamentalist it's all true thing to a very postmodern it's all fake news thing.
Which is equally fundamentalist.
And we've got to grow up and learn mature wisdom in between somewhere.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you, and we look forward to hearing from you at the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much. Good to talk to you.